see here. My name's Mark Lutz. I'm Senior Advisor for Global Climate Change for WWF International, and I represent WWF on the Sustainable Shipping Initiative. Andrew, who I'll introduce in a second, will say more about what the Sustainable Shipping Initiative is. But I can tell you it's been a very interesting experience working with this group of representatives of a wide range of industries from the shipping sector, from finance to ship owners to suppliers, and it's quite a wide range of companies and quite a wide range of individuals and personalities who participate in the SSI, and I can say that it's all the individuals represented. At least I can't say too much. Others can talk about the companies involved. But certainly the individuals are completely committed to the sustainability of the shipping industry and changing practices and finding the most sustainable way forward for the industry, including addressing greenhouse gas emissions and getting to zero as soon as possible, and by 2050. In line with what's required for 1.5 to limit warming, for the shipping sector to do its share to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, according to the IPCC report. I'll just briefly introduce the panelists and then turn it over to Andrew. Andrew Stevens is the Executive Director of the SSI. He's worked in the industry for 30 years. As COO and other positions of leading companies in the sector. And he joined the SSI in August of 2018. Fernanda Carvalho is representing WWF on the panel. She has a long background in environmental issues and climate. She's a global policy manager for the WWF's climate and energy practice. She has a PhD in international relations and has a lot of experience working with several NGOs and the Brazilian government. Online, we have
Simon Bennett. Simon Bennett.
Yes, thank you. Simon Bennett dialing in from Singapore. He's the head of sustainable development for the China Navigation Company, which is part of the family-owned conglomerate Swire Group. Simon has been working with the shipping industry since the age of 17, when he ran away from home to become a sailor. And he'll have, I'm sure you'll enjoy his comments about the report. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew to give a proper intro to the SSI and this event.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Yep, thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us this morning, both here in the room and via Facebook live stream. So as Mark said, I'll get started and just run through, hopefully it's come up, yes. So who is the SSI? As Mark mentioned there, we are a cohort of leading and like-minded actors who are focused on the long-term sustainability in the industry. And as you can see from the members, there are some big names, recognizable names, and they really do cover the value chain from banks, cargo owners, ship owners, classification societies, rating, shipyard also engaged in this, as well as two NGOs, Forum for the Future, Sustainability Organization, and WWF, as Mark is the member representative also. How does the SSI work? Well, we're very much focused on thought leadership and leading the way for the industry in a cozy, let's say, environment or intimate environment where the members can discuss and share best practice, learnings from each other, collaborate on working for future activities that are the right things to do for the environment, economic or social pillars going forwards, which sometimes leads to initiatives that they work on together. We work on together perhaps as the SSI, or they take away and they work further on individually in their own sustainability strategies. So decarbonisation, this is one of the work streams in the SSI, and although we are running the inquiry and sharing with you today the findings and report launch of our inquiry into what is the role of biofuels in decarbonisation of shipping, biofuels is just one of the alternatives, of course, and the SSI is fuel and technology agnostic. So we are not here to describe a position of the SSI towards biofuels, but explain the inquiry and the process that we have run and the outcomes from that inquiry. We are focused, of course, on all the other alternatives in this decarbonisation frame. So, sorry, I'm speaking a little close to the mic so Simon can hear us on that. So I'm a bit close to it, right? So what is shipping doing about decarbonisation? We are fortunate enough, and it's been said in several presentations here over the last couple of days and few days probably, that we have a global regulator in the form of the International Maritime Organization. It's a UN agency. And there's an initial strategy released in April 2018 talking and setting goals around absolute GHG emission reduction by 50% on a basis compared to a baseline of 2008 and achieving this by 2050. And there will be a review of the strategy and the ambition coming up in 2023 where the goals will be revisited. But what is for sure is that as well as zero-emission capable vessels being commercially available and in operation by around 2030, at the latest, is the discussion because of the lifetime of vessels being 20, 25 and sometimes 30 years. So the asset play here is a long period. And for us to achieve as an industry the goal by 2050, we need to start having these vessels capable of operating and being propelled by zero-emission fuels and propulsion technology by 2030. So zero-carbon fuels will need to be commercially available, of course, and produced from either electricity, biomass, or natural gas with carbon capture and storage. Sorry, to carry on. Poseidon Principles has been launched. Some of you may have attended a session yesterday. This is a coalition of 13 leading banks who have signed up so far. And this is where the mechanisms for transparency and reporting of GHG emissions and trends will be captured by banks as part of their lending portfolio and reported on the basis of ship owners' improvements, etc. Getting to Zero Coalition, as is said here, this is a partnership between the Global Maritime Forum, or sometimes known as GMF, Friends of the Ocean Action and World Economic Forum, and was launched at the UN General Assembly during Climate Week in September 19. SSI is proud and keen to be one of 6 contributing knowledge partners, and we're just at the start of exploring the work streams in the coalition and SSI's role going forwards in terms of work. But the coalition is at a fast start. It's already more than 100 signatories, of which some governments are part of that. Science-Based Targets Initiative. SSI will be working closely with the SBTI as they look to develop sectoral science-based targets going forward. So we're engaged with the initiative. As you can see, some leading actors in the industry are already engaged, and others are in discussion to engage and commit and set targets going forwards. So who is already working with biofuels? Well, there are some leading actors, and not all are mentioned here. Here are some. We have IKEA working closely with CMA CGM. We have Maersk, who are working with H&M and Heineken. And MSC have just recently announced their commitment to 30% use of biofuel loading in the port of Rotterdam. There are others, of course, that are trialling, such as DS Norden in Denmark also. Some ports are also preparing themselves. Rotterdam, I just mentioned, they're one of those that are preparing themselves ready for alternative fuels infrastructure, and recently we met with MPA Singapore, and they informed that they are also readying themselves for the future fuels that may be required in the port, considering the possible alternatives and the safety concerns around some of those. So, as I mentioned, there's various alternative fuels that are being discussed. There's no, as it stands today, one silver bullet solution to this dilemma. There's a lot of activity and a lot of discussion by many across the industry and across into upstream as well. And it's in the upstream that it's being clearly recognized where the significant investment will be. The shipping industry is dependent on a global supply of fuels, so it's subject to an infrastructure being in place and energy providers being willing to supply these fuels across the globe and make sure the supply channels actually work. So in terms of some of the alternatives I'll list here, electrofuels, which are zero carbon synthetic fuels, such as hydrogen, ammonia, and methanol, and all of these carry some safety risks which would need to be mitigated and worked with. In the history and heritage of fossil fuels, of course, this is a combustible material, so these safety issues have been addressed over many years, but will need to be addressed also then with the alternative fuels coming forwards, whatever they may be. And there are different harmful effects to those involved in the industry should there be a release of those products. Biofuels is of course one of these. Our inquiry is based on that, so we'll talk a little bit more in a short while. Liquefied natural gas, there's limited reduction potential. Some cruise ships are adopting, and so this is seen by many and reported by many who are involved in this discourse that this is a solution over a term, and perhaps bio-LNG is an alternative to LNG as it stands going forwards. There's also electricity based on batteries, and that is, of course, a challenge today for deep-sea, long-haul shipping, but is in operation with some short-sea operators, and you'll have read or know about this in terms of short-sea ferries, particularly by actors in and around Norway. So am I there? Yes, so the SSI process that we have run, this kicked off basically for us in early 2018 when we worked with UMass and Lloyd's Register exploring zero emission vessels and what needs to be done. This resulted in some alternative fuels being suggested, and biofuels was one of those. Was seen to be a feasible, economically feasible alternative, and technically feasible also in terms of its ability to drop in both as the use as a fuel in the current combustion and engine technologies on board vessels, but also in the supply infrastructure that exists today. So it was seen to be a convenient way forwards. However, as we all know, there are complex issues arising around the use of biofuels in terms of a system perspective and land use, etc. So during 2018, the SSI members discussed the outcome of the report that was published for SSI. You'll find this on our website also. We worked on a knowledge paper which basically raised what are the key issues that we would want to address as an industry around biofuels. And the two emerging key pillars of this was sustainability and availability of those biofuels. So towards the end of 2018, we decided that the way forward was to take a deep dive and convene a multi-stakeholder debate and discussion around this. And this we have run through 2019, and we describe here in terms of the process, the stakeholder views, scientific desktop research data, etc., exploring the sustainability considerations and the availability as a total availability of biofuels, and what would potentially be an availability for shipping, considering other sectors' demand or other transport demands. So we ran a seminar in June 2019, which was focused purely on sustainability. That was at WWF offices in Brussels. Seminar 2 was based on availability, and that was at the IMO headquarters in early July. We followed this up with a webinar for those that were unable to join our seminars earlier or from other parts of the world, and interested parties that wanted to join our discussion and engage with us. And this led to a high-level event culminating our inquiry during Climate Week in New York, where we had an esteemed panel from the Port of New York and New Jersey, WWF, Below 50 initiative, Maersk. We had an ex-VP from a classification society, now an independent board member in the industry, and the Energy Transitions Commission. And we have then taken all the findings and emerging conversation and distilled this into our report, which is now available and is on our website. You have some flyers in the room with a QR code that you can link to the report. So the report is live and available from our website to download. I mentioned the engagement of stakeholders. This pie chart shows the array of stakeholders that have been engaged. I think we had around 110 approximately stakeholders engaged with us along the journey. And as you can see, there's been a fair spread across the industry. So this has not been purely a ship owner discussion or a regulator discussion. We've had academia, charterers, ports, government, and other sectors such as aviation join us in this discussion, because one of the elements here, as mentioned, is what would be available for shipping out of the total availability. Here are some of the pictures of some of the activities. Some faces you may recognize. Mark is here as well, so he's in one of those. And culminating in our members meeting in Singapore in October, where we worked on the conclusion of the findings. On availability, we won't go too much into the data. You can see these charts in the report, but we have two charts that I'll just share here, and one is just to exemplify the ranges and uncertainty in the availability of biofuels and the different estimates based on different variables and different assumptions. Sorry, I moved on. So you can see here that there are wide differences of opinion based on the models that are being used to ascertain what the availability of biofuels is in the industry. So this makes it very difficult to work with some assumptions in terms of availability going forwards. But we have focused on the right-hand side here. You can see a low range and a high range assumption that we have used in our report. We also took a look, as mentioned there, the dependency towards the demand from other sectors. And again, there are potential low and potential high depending on the source and the inputs that have been given. And whilst it may be seen that if shipping was alone in the demand for biofuels, then we would probably be able to cover what we consider in this report, from what we've heard, as a potential demand. But there are other competing sectors, and we're amongst harder to abate industries. So The competing forces, of course, come into play here in terms of what would potentially be a supply and that what would potentially be a demand. Just quickly some key findings then before we move on to the panel being engaged. In terms of sustainability, I'll highlight a few. You find these in the report. What emerged is that clearly there's indirect impacts from biofuels which are difficult to track and measure. The carbon credentials of certain biomass feedstock pose higher risk of indirect impacts, e.g. from purpose-grown crops from energy. There's strong land governance and clear carbon and biodiversity credentials would need to be viable to produce biofuels. And in this context, there would be a clear need for robust certification schemes that carry high integrity for this to be acceptable in terms of use by the industry. In terms of availability, as you've seen, estimates vary due to the different variables and assumptions. The data on current production is currently uncomprehensive. Potentially increased demand is likely to realize from other sectors and compete for the source. And again, different demands on sources may realize, and different use of land may occur, varying the availability of biofuels or biofeedstock along the route. And this will be regional or national levels. Aviation is likely to squeeze the supply, and shipping's potential demand, and for how long, is also not certain at this stage. So without further ado, following on from that, I'd like to then cover the panel discussion and invite Fernanda to share some reflections on our inquiry and the subject.
Good morning to you all. It's my pleasure to be here representing WWF with the Sustainable Shipping Initiative. My colleague Mark Lutz represents us in this effort and has been doing it for 2 years now. And as I'm not a shipping specialist, my talk will be more around the importance of the report and why is it important for WWF to be part of such an initiative. Shipping represents 2 to 3% of global emissions, and I'm now paraphrasing Greta Thunberg, no sector is too small to make a contribution in the fight against the climate emergency. She says no one is too small to make a difference. I'm saying no sector is too small to make a difference. As put out by the IPCC last year, the IPCC 1.5 report, the so-called 1.5 report that was launched in November 28, we need a sectoral transformation and a deep cut in all sectors. And when we talk about the 4 sectoral transformations, we're talking about a transformation on land and natural systems, a transformation on the energy system, on urban and infrastructure systems, and also in the industry systems. And I think the discussion on biofuels connects to at least 3 of those systems. We're talking about land and the disputes about land use already mentioned, very strong in the country I'm from, Brazil. I'm talking about the energy transformation. We see the role of biofuels more as a transitional fuel till we have the zero emission fuels developed, the electrofuels such as hydrogen, ammonia, and methanol that pose safety risks, as you mentioned. And this connects very much to the industry transformation, what industry can do. And of course, biofuels is not a comfortable discussion, but a much needed one. And it's really great to see that the shipping sector is tackling this somehow. I think that it's very important that the Sustainable Shipping Initiative has NGOs participating. There are 2 NGOs participating in the discussions, and WWF is one of them. So we really welcome this report because it sheds light on such a controversial issue that we think needs to be discussed. If there was a simple solution to the problem of halting emissions in all sectors, we wouldn't need this conference here, and we wouldn't need to be in this Panda Hub. That's why we are here, to discuss with different sectors, different ideas, different stakeholders, And this report takes the same approach when it discusses sustainability considerations connected to biofuels, when it discusses the availability of sustainable biofuels, and also the availability of such biofuels for the shipping sector, because we know there are other sectors that will need to discuss the use of biofuels, such as the aviation sector, just to present an example. So some conclusions of the report that I'd like to highlight is the need for market incentives for biofuels. For example, IMO, the International Maritime Organization, short-term policy measures. Of course, we need to look at the consumers and, of course, the market and the willingness of paying a premium for lower carbon supply chains. And that depends on the consumers and how the consumers are going to tackle this. Certification and discussion of sustainability considerations will be much needed, and policies also play a role in this sense. For example, zoning policies for biofuels. We know that, of course, the biofuels from residues, the biomass from residues, and also from waste, of course, would be the most preferred solution, because they do not only tackle the problem from a carbon perspective, but also from a pollution perspective and from a dealing with residues perspective. But since we don't have those, and we are going to the extent that is needed to fulfill the 50 to 100 exajoules that are the demand of the shipping sector, of course, we might need to resort to purpose-grown crops, and then we'll need to consider very strongly certification schemes. So I would also highlight that we need to cooperate with various actors and players, and this report, as I already mentioned, is an example of this. A throughout discussion with other sectors is much needed. So this is a conclusion that I would also like to highlight. And as I mentioned before, WWF thinks it's very important to be part of those discussions, because the solutions will have to be built in close cooperation with other sectors. And we see biofuels as playing a role in a transitional pathway towards the zero emission electrofuels. So we think that things that sectors could be doing would also be to the so-called science-based targets that you already mentioned. So those could play a role in the in the transition of the shipping sector, and we will remain engaged. We will participate in this initiative. We think that this study is an opportunity to invite others to take part in such a throughout and very relevant discussion that we start here and that we will continue engaged. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you, Fernando. So what we will do now, before we open up the floor, is we'll also listen to Simon Bennett, who will join us via video, hopefully coming up. So Simon, as mentioned, is with the China Navigation Company, and he is based in Singapore, and he's the General Manager for Sustainability at China Navigation. So Simon, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can
Great.
you hear me?
Yes, we can. So please, the floor's yours.
Okay, good morning, Europe. It's nearly time to go to bed here. From the beginning, we're taking an overview. Shipping, along with aviation, was omitted from Kyoto and thus the Paris Agreement. But whilst shipping tends to be invisible, we're not invisible enough. My personal view is that we are seen as being a cash cow. Everyone else is chipping in and we're sort of sailing around doing nothing. So we will be targeted pretty quickly, whether we do anything or not, and it's obviously better to do something than not do something. In my particular case, our chairman said 30 years ago that we will seek to be beyond legislation, both from the point of view of the general public good and enlightened self-interest. So those two things sort of coalesce in my end of the world here as a member of the Sustainable Shipping Initiative. We have to move. We have to do something. which led us to move towards producing this report. As Andrew said, we do not see biofuel as the silver bullet, or probably even a silver bullet, but it's certainly, having looked at it in depth, it's one of the areas that will benefit from much further study. But we have to assure ourselves that the biofuel that we could use is both sustainable and it's available. And that's what's dealt with in this report that you've got the link to. And I believe you said there are one or two copies around there. It's also important to bear in mind with respect to shipping that whilst IMO has done a lot of good work and is moving certainly in the right direction in this area, the initial strategy that they produced in March or April last year at MEPC 74, it's not a regulation. It's a statement of good intent. There are no regulations and there are no penalties if we don't do it. You combine that with the fact that a ship has, as an asset, a capital asset, has got a generally 25, 30-year life. We need to move fairly quickly to have the right assets in place to reduce both our intensity and our absolute emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. We can't wait until 2050. There'll be far too big an overhang of another 29 years of some ships left, which will not help us. So we need to move soon. Having looked into the potential of biofuel, it's fairly obvious that it's a good solution at the moment. It's a drop-in fuel, so it doesn't require, well, it requires not a great deal, or very small capex expenditure. And in a Lloyd's Register and Maersk study of all the available alternate fuels which could be used, only 15% is ever of capex, or 15% of the expense is required by the ship owner. What it constrains us, or what will constrain us going forwards, is the fact that 85%, more or less, of the expenditure is upstream in the, whatever you want to call them, the energy supply companies, whether they're producing wind, sail, nuclear, biofuel, whatever. The expenditure, the vast majority of the expenditure is going to be required upstream, and it's also going to require regulation to go with it. So having sort of given that sort of helicopter view, we have done my company has done, as a member of SSI, we have done a small-scale biofuel trial. We have, within the group, we own a biofuel production company in the UK, but the closest we could get the ship, which was sailing from Norway to Brazil, was Rotterdam. So we shipped it over by tanker, which is why by road tanker. So it was quite a small scale trial, but it worked but the biofuel as a drop-in fuel, once you flush through your lines, was very successful. It's got a higher cetane count than fossil fuel, so you actually get more bang for your buck, pretty much literally. So it does work on a small scale. We then need to look at its, which is what the report does, as to whether it really is sustainable. And that's going to take quite a while, we found, from talking to all the stakeholders, as to what is sustainable and what is not sustainable. The internal biofuel company that we own in the UK actually produces biofuel from municipal waste. But we don't have enough to power all 50 or 60,000 merchant ships which are out there at the moment, but that can be grown. It does appear from the report once you delve into the details, that biofuel capacity or production at the moment is probably sufficient to power most of the ships at the low end of the estimates initially. However, we aren't the only sector being pressured to reduce our carbon footprint. Aviation has been mentioned, road transport is there, and there are many others. It's difficult to predict the supply-demand dynamics as we move forward. If it's seen as being an early silver bullet, a lot of people are going to go for it, and obviously availability will go down and then the price will go up. My personal view, this is not SSI or the industry, my personal view is that to drive behavioral change, you need to put a dollar value on it. But that makes me pretty unpopular at shipping meetings when I suggest we need a market-based measure. In my view, that's what is required to move significant and early behavioral change. And the second issue, which is entwined with that, is whether a biofuel, a particular biofuel, actually is sustainable. There are many different views from the over 100 stakeholders that we talk to. Some said it can be, and some said it will never be, and there is everybody else in between. There are unfortunately, or partly fortunately, partly unfortunately, there are a number of standards out there. Some are better recognized than others, but until the production industry or side of things for biofuel gets a landing on a standard which many people are happy with, we're going to have endless arguments as to whether we are actually doing the right thing to reduce climate change or not. But that's pretty much out of our hands as a user at the far end of the supply chain, but that is certainly something which needs looking at. As a company, we would never, or we'd stay a long way away from biofuel produced from a food feedstock. And then it gets much deeper, and WWF are much better placed to talk about that than I am. So we see biofuel, it's currently available, it's being used, it does work. The tension between aviation needing to do something, and whilst there was an electric seaplane flight yesterday, I think, you're not going to be able to scale up the energy storage through batteries on planes for a while yet. So, and biofuel is in use in some engines on some flights. So it is possible. But the tension between aviation and marine, there is a tension, but as with conventional fossil fuel, producing kerosene and the lower end fractions for shipping, my understanding is that's similar in biofuel production. There will be a higher end and a lower end fraction. So that may be okay in the near future. The problem will be volume to keep everyone who wants to use it supplied. I think that covers my initial comments, sort of taking a helicopter view and then getting a little bit more technical.
That's great,
so I hand
Simon.
that back to Andrew.
Great, thank you very much. So what we'll do now is open to the floor for any questions that you may have for the panel. So we'll bring a microphone across.
Yes. So hello. Nuria Blázquez from Ecologistas en Acción is an NGO here in Spain. An NGO here in Spain. Well, It's close enough?
That's better,
Okay.
yes, thank you.
So I'm from an NGO here in Spain, and we work on biofuels. I came here today because I was very surprised to be together, both things, sustainability and biofuels together. And I can really stress enough how disappointed I feel to see WWF defending and advocating for biofuels. I mean, there are so many human rights involved, and it's also about climate change. I mean, we had the global report of the European Commission, and we very well know that this report say that all biofuels cause more climate change because of the ILO reasons. So I don't really understand why we are discussing to use biofuels now in shipping. We know how bad they are for road transport, so how can we really speak about an alternative? What do you think about the deforestation in Indonesia and Malaysia? And what about soya? And I mean, we know that all the certification we have at the moment don't guarantee at all any sustainability for those regions and cause even more damage. So the European Union is now considering palm oil as unsustainable, and we know that there are still quite a lot of loopholes for this, and palm oil will be still used in Europe and in road transport. How can we now start using this for shipping? Why we don't think about any other alternative now that we very well know that biofuels and crop biofuels are causing so much damage?
Yes, so thank you. Before Fernando comments on why WWF, but I'll just mention there that, you know, we don't have a position. We're not advocating biofuels. This was an inquiry into the potential as one of the alternatives, because it is being emerging from earlier research that this is a potential for the industry, as it is for other industries. So, Fernando, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I would comment along the same lines that in any time I have used the words defending or advocating for biofuels, we are just participating in a discussion. And I am from Brazil, and I have 15 years of working to control deforestation in the Amazon. And in Brazil, we have been at the forefront of a fight against a decree that Bolsonaro issued that just revoked the sugarcane zoning in Brazil. We were very much against it because we think that zoning or planting sugarcane in already degraded areas was one of the policies that could, and I'm stressing could, control the damage that biofuels do. So I didn't take any kind of position. WWF is participating in a discussion on decarbonizing sectors, and biofuels are discussed as an alternative in this context. If we had the alternatives for decarbonization, and if they were easy and available at the scale that we need them, of course we would be promoting those, but we are not here promoting biofuels. That's not our intention at all. We are promoting, yes, a discussion.
Yes, and to add, what you'll see in the report as well is that while certification and the integrity and high bar of the certification to be applied needs to be relied upon, there are still many who doubt because of the indirect effects of biofuels who question the validity of certification as itself. So just moving along.
I need to stress a little bit about her comment. I'm Angela Fey from Brazil as well. I know that there are lots of discussions around deforestation and the biofuels issue, but I can bring Brazilian perspective on it. I run a car 100% with ethanol. It's 90% more sustainable than gasoline. And they talk all the time here it's not about defining one solution. It's about finding which is the best for it. And about deforestation, Brazilian government recently approved RenovaBio, which is actually a law that promotes biofuels. And it's extremely written there that it's not allowed any kind of biofuels originated from deforestation actions. Even it has some human rights perspectives as well. And I can also say you that there's technology today that produces biofuels from biomass, which is actually waste. So it's not about being 100% connected with biofuels, but it's about finding which are the solutions available. Even electricity. Everybody's talking about electric cars, but it's not available for everyone. We don't have electricity for lots of houses in lots of places. So I understand your point, but it's not about going only one direction. We have to find all the solutions available and do our best.
Yeah, and it also emerges through the report, based on the inquiry with the stakeholders engaged, that the preference would always be for what's described as advanced biofuels, not first-generation crop-based rapeseed or soy or palm oil, etc. So there's a question at the back there.
Good morning.
Sorry,
my name
Andrew.
is Truls Gullofsen from Rainforest Foundation, Norway. Very interesting discussion. We've been working a lot with biofuels, especially the palm oil problems, with our partners in Indonesia for a long time, and try to sort of fight back that problem, both in food, but also when we sort of got a new wave of direct and indirect deforestation consequences from palm oil. So I'm very, very happy to hear that you are also from the shipping industry yourself, sort of trying at least to exclude the food crops for biofuel, because the first generation, as we see it on a general basis, whether that is soy or palm oil or other food crops, perhaps with exclusion of sugarcane if the zoning was in place, but now it's not. They have shot themselves, unfortunately, in the foot. But that must be excluded because of the massive direct and indirect consequences, regardless of certification systems, because at the moment, and I think in the next 25 years, there is zero hope to expect that there will be proper boundaries and governance in the countries that are able to produce these large-scale first-generation biofuels, even with certification, because we just get the demand and destruction another place, and we've seen that very systematically. What I think is very, so I really, really hope that the shipping industry, when you enter this, actively exclude the first-generation food crops, because otherwise this will be very, very dangerous. We are having the same discussion with the aviation industry. Yeah. It's a big problem when there are so far very few aviation companies are actively excluding the problem crops. And I think that is the first test of real sustainability for any industry that goes the biofuel lane, is to actively exclude those feedstocks that we know are creating problems and are also competing with people's food. Secondly, I think the approach in the report is extremely interesting, drop of cold water in sort of the general bioenergy debate, by assessing the total potential and comparing that with the total demand, because this doesn't add up. And I think that message from the report is one of the most important sort of in this fact-finding mission, because all sectors are now planning to solve their climate footprint with biofuel or other sources of bioenergy, that they have no plans to assess whether it exists or whether their use is the most rational use. Of course, the long-haul aviation and long-haul shipping is by far, as far as we can see it, the clearest role for the very limited sustainable biofuel resources. So I think this report is extremely interesting, and but then the question is, have you considered, because I thought that the investment threshold and the distribution between sort of suppliers and consumers is very interesting. So have you considered or discussed in the report or other places how the shipping industry can take your part of the task, since you don't need to make big investments on the vessels? What can you do to facilitate the production? And I think especially in sort of, so what can you do to take your part, not only buying from the market, but creating supply of sustainable sources? Second small sub-question is, have you considered at all algae-based production or marine-based production? No. Because at least in my gut feeling, I think kind of waste is important, but also growing the ocean can be an important way of both producing food, but in particular biofuel for future supply.
Yeah. So very quickly, because we're running out of time, but in terms of third generation or algae or marine ocean sources, no, that's beyond the scope. We didn't discuss this. The debate and discussion that arose focused very much on that first and second generation, and the preference there was clearly emerging for second generation and understanding the complexities around the source. Again, I repeat, we don't have a position that this was an inquiry. And in terms of the future engaging with the energy side, the infrastructure and the source and supply chain, etc., that is work still to be done. It's very clearly a focus in the Getting to Zero coalition, of which we're a knowledge partner, and so our efforts in engaging that discussion will be through that coalition. I think we've got time for 2 very quick questions, and then we probably have to wrap up.
Andrew?
Yes, Simon.
Yeah, if I could just come back to the First Lady, we're pretty much aligned with her. On page 4 of the report, we lay out that any sourcing of soy or palm-based biofuel runs a high risk of indirect land use change and stakeholder reputational risks. So we recognize that just as much as she obviously fervently feels. And then coming back to the last questioner there in the audience, again, 2 paragraphs below that, ideally we should not involve biofuel which involves the significant use of plants which compete with food production. I mentioned that briefly when I was talking, and I think that's pretty strong. We don't want to be taking food away from cheap food or cheap food products away from people who need it. So I think we're aligned on that as well.
Yeah.
Biofuel is not the only thing that we are looking at as a company. We're also looking at green methanol from waste products. We're looking at hydrogen on ships. We're working with the Port of Auckland in that area. So we're not focused on this and going to find a way to get biofuel into our tanks. We recognize there are a whole range of different issues we need to look at. The last questioner asked, what can we do to facilitate production? We can throw a whole bag of money at it, but we're actually a shipping company, and the upstream energy providers, in whichever sector they happen to work in, they need to feel that there's a business case to produce fuel of a certain type, and again, it's another project that we're working on here in Singapore with the technical university here. They are doing research on producing cleaner fuels, but they need to know from the likes of ourselves and another major shipping company based in Japan, who I'm under an NDA with, that we would buy it if they produced it. The whole supply chain needs to be there. So we are all working on it. We recognize that something must be done, and biofuel is one potential answer, providing it can be shown to be sustainable.
Yes, that's the key. Thank you, Simon. So just 2 quick questions, Robert.
Yeah, this is a plea for the future. This has already been partly answered. The doldrums, the intertropical convergence zones, you've got thousands of square kilometers of the Earth's surface of calm water, lots of sun, lots of rain. The idea of putting shipping and biofuels together to have in some point in the future massive production of biomass there which can go into biofuels. And I think that for shipping to look forward and say, if somebody did this, then you can have regulation which require basically long-distance ships to use it, so the market's there. So I do think that that's something which the Sustainable Shipping Initiative should be putting effort into. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Last question. Sorry, we're running out of time.
My name is Maulana. I was a research assistant at Dartmouth College working on lignocellulosic bioethanol. So my question is, from us, the supply side, we can use techno-economics analysis or life cycle assessments to see, to optimize that the product that we make is cheap or sustainable. But from you, the demand side, what metrics do you use in determining which alternative to choose? Because both biofuels, advanced biofuels, or even electrified ships or whatever, both unproven. So do you use dollars per megajoule, or what metrics do you use? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think this is the deep work that needs to be done, and we're running out of time. It's been mentioned lots of times in lots of places, and the focus for working collaboratively across this and working also to set targets is a key focus that SSI will be engaged in, either in getting to Zero Coalition or the Science-Based Targets Initiative in contributing to defining those. So thank you. So just summing up then very quickly, for ourselves as SSI, it's not very clear which are the potential zero carbon alternatives to fossil fuels as the winning combination of availability, supply, and competitiveness, comparing price, of course, and the dynamics there. As you heard, shipping cannot solve or manage these risks and uncertainties alone or in isolation. It's cross-sectorial, and there's very much system issues to be dealt with. But the research does show that in the short term, biofuels could have a potential to play a significant role to accelerate early decarbonisation across the maritime sector in support of our endeavour for zero-emission shipping by 2050. So I'd like to wrap it up there. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you, Fernanda and Simon, for yours.
Yeah.
Oh, last word by Fernanda.
No, my last words is that the title of the report is The Role of Sustainable Biofuels, and every time we as WWF will be talking about biofuels, of course we're talking about sustainability issues connected to those.
Yeah, absolutely essential, as mentioned earlier, on certification. Final word from Simon?
No, we're actually also looking at sailing ships in the Pacific with no engines at all. So that should keep everyone happy.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, everybody that's been online as well.